it's just Martine, and today we're going to be reading some books from a family friend's book collection. There is a very, very dear family friend. He retired this past year, and when they were cleaning out his office, my dad asked him if I could come and pick some books that I wanted to have of his, and he said, of course, sure. And so I went and I looked at all of them and I picked them, and some of them are like textbook type things that I'm not going to read straight through, but some of them are books that I'm going to read straight through, and I found it to be a really interesting collection to look through. There was a lot of nonfiction, like self-improvement type stuff, and I'm also really interested in reading that type of stuff. So that's mainly what we have in this stack here to read for this video. But the book that I'm going to start with was actually a huge and very pleasant surprise, because growing up, I listened to audiobooks to fall asleep. I still do, but one of the audiobooks that we had on CD, like that we owned, was this book called The Cricket in Times Square. I just thought it was something that we randomly owned, and then when I was looking through all of his books, I saw it, and that's how I learned that the reason we had that CD was because he had introduced my parents to this book. This is a very special book to me. Even another family friend knows the story behind this and me, and knows this person too, and so she gifted me a copy of the audiobook to have on my phone to live there forever so I can listen to it once again while falling asleep. And I've done that a little, but I haven't listened to it straight through because I was saving my straight through reading of it for this video. So this is what I'm gonna start with. I'm excited about this one. This is just such a nostalgic book for me and so special, and I'm hoping to get some insight into this family friend through reading some of his books. So let's get to it. Okay, so I finished the first book for this, which was The Cricket in Times Square, and I genuinely cannot give you an objective rating of this. I gave it 5 stars, but this book also holds such an incredible amount of nostalgia for me, and the story is so comforting to me that I genuinely have no idea how anybody who didn't grow up with this book would feel reading this book, if that makes sense. But in this one, we're following like a couple characters. Technically, the main character, I guess, is this cricket named Chester Cricket, who accidentally makes his way to the Times Square subway station, where he is taken in by a family, the Bellinis, particularly the son of the family. And that family is also like a focus of the story because they're quite a poor family and they run this newsstand that's not doing very well. We see Chester the cricket meet them, and we also see Chester meet other animals that live in the Times Square subway station. So Tucker Mouse, who I love, I think he's hilarious, and Harry Cat. And we just see some of their adventures together as Chester makes some beautiful music and explores New York City for the first time. And I just think it's such a cute and wholesome book, and also has good messages about like doing things you love for the right reasons instead of like for the external rewards of doing those things. And it's just a feel-good book to me. I definitely think I'll have a more objective view of the other books that I read for this video because I've never read those ones before, but this was just an absolute childhood favorite. Like, I couldn't give it anything less than 5 stars. It's just so dear to me, and I'm very grateful to this family friend for letting me now have his copy of this book so I can keep it forever and ever and cherish it. It is funny though, because I could like hear the audiobook in my head. I've just listened to it so much in my life. I could definitely like hear some of the characters' accents, especially Tucker Mouse, which is crazy because I don't always hear the words in a story when I'm reading it, but I've listened to the audiobook so much for this one that it's just kind of there. I do have to say there are a couple pros and cons of the audiobook versus the physical book. The physical book has illustrations that I'd never gotten to see before because I'd never read the physical book, but the audiobook does have like some violin music in it in between the different sections to represent the way that the cricket plays its wings, and that's cute too. So like they both have their pros and cons, but overall it's just like a lovely little time. I think with a lot of older books, especially nonfiction, you're going to have like some amount of insight and wisdom and some amount of stuff that's just past its due date and needs to be thrown away. That was definitely the case with The Conquest of Happiness by Bertrand Russell, which I'm giving 3 stars. There were some things that I wholeheartedly disagreed with in this, so it couldn't rate higher than a 3 stars, but those things were also very much common around the time that this was written. When was this published? 1951. So she's been around the block a little bit, but there were still enough nuggets of like infinite wisdom in this for me to see some benefit in having read it. And particularly because I'm doing it for the sake of this video, where I'm reading these books that lived in the collection of this family friend. I think the nonfiction is giving me like a very keen insight onto how this person's beliefs may be developed, because I see in this book a lot of the things that I know that this family friend has always emphasized, like where you get your validation and your relationship with work and non-working things, and like the value of certain things in life. And so it was so interesting reading this book through the lens of like, this is a book that belonged to this specific person who had these types of thoughts, as opposed to just reading this. If I had just read this, there would have still been good quotes, but I feel a fondness for this book now because I was viewing it through the lens of understanding how somebody started to form some of their opinions about things in the world, you know? This book is basically just about like how to achieve happiness. It's interesting. It did take me forever to read though. Like, it's a short little book, but it took me almost a month to get through this. Like, I would read it 2-3 pages at a time. To be fair, the pages are like densely packed. The types of thoughts that you have to sit with sometimes, especially when I wrestled with the thoughts that have like changed over time in society or things that didn't align with my beliefs, just sitting and grappling with those things took time. I find in my process of growing as a human being that sometimes we know exactly what we need to do to be happy, but we always forget in the living of day-to-day life. And it is the constant reminder by reading books like this or hearing from other people talk about their experiences with happiness that remind us at times, oh yeah, there's this. I know this, but I'm bad at implementing it. And this is a reminder. And this book did that a lot for me, I think. And I've already forgotten a lot of what it said, but luckily I wrote some quotes down. So yeah. The next book that I read for this was The Courage to Be, which I'm unfortunately giving 2 stars. This was published in 1952, and it's this like philosophical argument about the courage to be. It's hard to say what that means. The back of this is written in such a clear, succinct way where you think you're going into it to talk about one thing, and the book itself is so convoluted, abstract, and complicated that I'm not sure I at all got what the back of this book said that I would get. It did have some good points that I followed. Mostly it just had points I didn't follow. I guess it's like a philosophical and theological discussion because it's written by a famous theologian, but regardless, the point is it was like overly complicated and abstract. It kind of talks about like meaning in life and anxiety and like fears about death and all that stuff. But again, it talks about it in really abstract ways, and that just made it like hard to gain anything from this. This does give me like some insight into what some of the writing at the time was like and what some of the thought at the time was like, which I do think is interesting. And again, there were a couple of interesting points here that I did follow, so I can't fault it too much. Also, this was originally sold for 95 cents. But yeah, that's another one down. And this one will definitely stay in my collection more fondly as a memory of the person whose library it originally belonged to, which is luckily stamped in the front of the book, compared to as a beloved part of my collection because I loved the book, because I didn't, but that's okay. The last book that I read for this is What You Can Change and What You Can't, which I'm giving 3 stars. This is actually a book about a ton of different psychological disorders and other types of problems along that vein, and what we have learned through the research about environment and biology, so what we can and can't change, and what therapies and techniques are most and least efficient for that change. Also, Ernie is here with me. I do think it was a really well thought out and researched book. It's just not going to be anything huge for me. 1, because a lot of this information I've already learned in my psychology classes, but 2, because it is quite out of date. It was written in the 90s, and the author keeps making reference to the DSM-3, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychology, and we're on the 5th edition of that now, and every time there's a new edition of the DSM, there are changes and different things based on research and clinical experience and all that stuff. So some of the things that were discussed in this book, especially things about like gender, are no longer supported in the DSM or in clinical practice and all that stuff, which made it like weird and uncomfortable to read those sections. But overall, I really liked the perspective of this book because I think, well, he said it explicitly, but the goal for this author was to show you that there are some things that you can change and there are some things that you cannot, and when there are things you can change, you figure out how to change them, and when there are things you can't change, you just have to accept them and you have to learn to live with them. It was largely based in research that existed at the time that this was written. There were also some opinions shared, not all of which I approved of or shared myself, but it is definitely like an interesting concept to break down all these common things like anxiety and depression and phobias, and to have a discussion about like what is at the root of those problems and what can we change and what can we not change. And also a good reminder of a lot of the things that I learned in Abnormal Psych, which it's always good to brush up on. As with pretty much every other book in this particular video, the purpose of reading it was not necessarily because I thought it would be the next best thing that I've ever read, but simply because I think a person's collection gives me insight into the life they've lived and the things they think and the things they've read. And I can see how this book gives me evidence that the family friend has always been interested very much in evidence-based research and support and therapy and interventions, which I can appreciate, and also is interested in keeping up to date with what the research has to say about issues like mental health, which I think speaks to some of the empathy I know this person to have. So I do think this was an interesting insight, and in general it was also just interesting to see how the author went about constructing this. That's one of the things I think about most when I read a psychology book that has a bunch of information that I already know, is I like sit there and I think to myself, I probably wouldn't have thought to frame it in the way that it was framed. And so that's always interesting. But yeah. Final book down. And with that, I have finished this secret TBR. I had a great time making this, even if I didn't love all the books. I just had a good time reflecting on this family friend and what I know about him and what I'm learning about him through this, and I just feel so honored to have part of his collection now in part of my library, and very thankful that he was willing to share and that I got to explore some philosophical and psychological readings and also read The Cricket in Times Square. So if you like this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below. Do you like reading other people's books to find out more about them as a person? And subscribe for more reading, writing, and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!